Article 1179. Every obligation whose performance does not depend upon a future or uncertain event or upon a past event unknown to the parties is demandable at once. Every obligation which contains a resolutory condition shall also be demandable without prejudice to the effect of the happening of the event. Article 1179. So, sa first sentence, pinag-uusapan is about pure obligation. Pure obligation, ito yung obligation na demandable at once. Dahil yung sinasabing performance, dito ay walang kondisyon at wala rin itong term at walang specific date for its fulfillment. Conditional obligation. A conditional obligation is one whose consequences are subject in one way or another to the fulfillment of a condition. What is condition? Condition is a future and uncertain event upon the happening of which the effectivity of extinguishment of an obligation or right subject to it depends. So, sa conditional obligation, ito ang future and uncertain event na kung saan nakadepende yung debtor or yung obligation. Kapag sinabing future and uncertain, ito yung walang katiyakan or hindi mo alam kung mangyayari or hindi. Yung condition nagpo-pertain din sa past event or unknown to the parties. Yung past event is condition pa din siya at hindi pwedeng future and certain event ang condition dahil hindi na ito magiging condition, magiging obligation with a term na. Two principal kind of condition. First, suspensive condition. Condition precedent or condition antecedent. Or one, the fulfillment of which will give rise to an obligation or right. In other words, the demandability of the obligation is suspended until the happening of the uncertain event which constitute the condition. So, sa suspensive, pinapasuspend yung obligation hanggang sa mangyari na ang condition at dun na magkakaroon ng visa ang obligation. Ibig sabihin, no fulfillment, no obligation. Second principle is resolutory condition. Condition subsequent or one the fulfillment of which will extinguish an obligation or right already existing. Sa resolutory, kabaliktaran lang siya ng suspensive. The obligation takes effect at once. Agad may obligation pero nawawala siya upon the happening of the event of the condition. So example, D in payment of his debt to C binds himself to give C 3,000 pesos monthly allowance until C graduates from college. This obligation is demandable now, but it shall be extinguished or terminated upon the happening of the resolutory condition since graduating from college. So, sa example, si D, magbibigay siya ng 3,000 a month hanggang makagraduate si C sa college. Kapag nakagraduate si C, matatapos na din yung obligation ni D. Distinction between suspensive and resolutory condition. The difference between the two conditions is very clear. Both bear influence on the existence of the obligation, but in the diametrically opposed. So, sa distinction between suspensive and resolutory condition, pinapakita yung pagkakaiba between suspensive and resolutory condition. Sa suspensive condition, hindi natatapos or patuloy pa din ang obligation, pero sa resolutory, natatapos once na natapos na yung obligation and na-fulfill na yung obligation na sinasabi. So, paano nga ba natin malalaman na ang obligation is demandable at once? First, when it is pure, at nakikita natin yun sa tinakal natin sa Article 1179. Then second, when it is subject to a resolutory condition. 3, when it is subject to a resolutory period. Article 1180. When the debtor binds himself to pay when his means permit him to do so, the obligation shall be deemed to be one with a period subject to the provisions of Article 1197. Pertains sa Article 1180 ang obligation with the period. Kung ang conditional may future and uncertain sa obligation, sa obligation with the period naman, future and uncertain. Ibig sabihin, kapag si debtor ay nagsasabing magbabayad when his means permit him to do so, ito ay with a period and this obligation is not conditional. At ito ay nakabase sa law at sinabi ng batas, oras kung kailan i-fulfill yung obligation sa oras nagbe-base ang debtor and he is bound to deliver his obligation.
Article 1181. In conditional obligations, the acquisitions of right as well as extinguishment of or loss of those already acquired shall depend upon the happening of the event which constitutes the condition. 1114. So, sa Article 1181, pinapakita ang pagkakaiba sa pagitan ng suspensive condition and resolutory condition. Kapag sinabing acquisition of rights, ito ay kapag conditional obligation na suspensive of rights. Kapag naman resolutory condition, extinguishment or loss of the already acquired.
Article 1182. When the fulfillment of the condition depends upon the sole will of the debtor, the conditional obligation shall be void if it depends upon chance or upon the will of a third person. The obligation shall take effect in conformity with the provisions of this code. 1115. So, sa 1182, kapag yung fulfillment ng condition ay nakadepende dun sa sole will of the debtor or ng real creditor, it means yung conditional obligation ay mapapawalang visa or void. Classification of conditions. So, ito yung mga pwedeng ma-classify. First is as to effect. A. Suspensive. So, pag sinabing suspensive, ito yung condition niya na hindi natatapos. B. Resolutory. Ito yung obligation is natatapos once na natapos na ang condition. 2. As the form. A. Express. Ibig sabihin, malinaw na naisasaad ang condition. B. Implied. Hindi siya totally na isasaad. Number 3, as to possibility. A. Possible. Capable sa kanya ma-fulfill legally and physically. Letter B, impossible. Hindi kayang ma-fulfill or kabaligtaran lang ng possible. Number 4, as to cause or origin. Number A, potestative. Ibig sabihin yung condition nakadepende or one of the contracting parties. Number B, casual. Yung kondisyon nakadepende sa will of a third person. Number 5, as to mode. Letter A, positive. Isinasagawa ang kondisyon. Letter B, negative. Ibig sabihin yung kondisyon meron siyang omission of an act. And number 6, as to number. Letter A, conjunctive. Merong mga iilang kondisyon na dapat lahat ma-fulfill or magawa. Letter B, disjunctive. Merong iilang kondisyon pero iilan lang ang pwedeng magawa or yung pwedeng maisagawa. At hindi lahat yon matutupad. And last, number 7, as to divisibility. Letter A, divisible. Ibig sabihin yung condition is susceptible ng mga partial performance. Letter B, indivisible. Kabaliktaran lang siya ng divisible. Where suspensive condition depends upon will of debtor. Number 1, conditional obligation void. Where the potestative condition depends solely upon the will of the debtor, the conditional obligation shall be void because its validity and compliance is left to the will of the debtor. Article 1308. And it cannot therefore be easily demanded. In order not to be liable, the debtor will not just fulfill the condition. There is no burden on the debtor and consequently, no juridical tie is created. Article 1156. Number 2, only the condition void. If the obligation is pre-existing one and therefore does not depend for its existence upon the fulfillment by the debtor of the potestative condition, only the condition is void, leaving unaffected the obligation itself.
Here, the conditional is composed not on the birth of the obligation but on its fulfillment. Casual condition. If the suspensive condition depends upon chance or upon the will of the third person, the obligation subject to it is valid. Mixed condition. The obligation is valid if the suspensive condition depends partly upon chance and partly upon the will of a third person.
My cousin Pedro and I will continue the discussion of Stephanie Ravea to Article 1183. So, ano nga bang Article 1183? Article 1183, impossible condition, those contrary to good custom or public policy and those prohibited by law should annul the obligation which depends upon them. If the obligation is divisible, the part thereof which is not affected by the impossible or unlawful condition shall be valid. The condition not to do an impossible thing shall be considered as not having been agreed upon. So, ang Article 1183 refers to suspensive condition if applies only to case where the impossibility already existed at the time the obligation was constituted. If the impossibility arises after the creation of the obligation, Article 1266 converts. So, provision and contract. So, meron tayong pag-usapan dito na kinds of impossible condition. So, physically impossible condition and legally impossible condition. So, physically impossible condition when they in nature of things cannot exist or cannot be done. Example dito, I will pay you 10,000 pesos, it will not rain for 1 year in the Philippines. Legally impossible condition when they are contrary to law, morals, good custom, public order, or public policy. Example, one will give 10,000 pesos if Pedro will kill Salvador. Against siya sa law. Number 2, will be the common law wife of Juan. Against naman siya sa morals. Will lapse his father. Against siya sa good custom. Will publicly advocate the overthrow of the governments. Against naman siya sa public order. And lastly, will not appear as a witness against Juan in a criminal cases. Against siya sa public policy. So, meron tayong mga effects of impossible condition. One is conditional obligation void, impossible condition annul, and obligation which depends upon them. Ibig sabihin nun, yung nilagay na impossible, either physical impossible or legally impossible, i-annul niya yung obligation which depends upon them. Both the obligation and the condition are void. So, reason behind the law is that the obliger knows his obligation cannot be fulfilled. He has no intention to comply with his obligation. Number 2, conditional obligation valid. If the condition is negative, that is not to do an impossible thing, it is disregarded and the obligation is rendered pure and valid. Example, I will sell you my land if you do not carry 20 canvas of palay on your shoulder. So, the negative condition may not be given to impossible things, and the obligation are pure and therefore demandable at once. Number 3, only the affected obligation void. If the obligation is divisible, the part thereof not affected by the impossible condition shall be valid. So, divisible kasi is susceptible of partial fulfillment. Example, I will give you 10,000 if you sell my land and a car if you kill Pedro. So, pag nabenta mo yung lupa ko, ay bibigyan kita ng 10,000 pesos. At pag napatay mo si Pedro, ay ibibigay ko sa iyo yung car. So, in these cases, ang obligation niya ay dalawa. So, the obligation to give 10,000 pesos is valid, but the obligation na ibigay niya yung car is void kasi it is dependent upon at impossible condition. Legally, impossible condition. Number 4, only the condition void if the obligation is pre-existing obligation and therefore does not depend upon the fulfillment of the condition which is possible for its existence, only the condition is void. So, may pre-existing tayo. So, ano nga muna palang ibig sabihin ng pre-existing? So, before kang mag-impose ng condition, there is already valid and distinct obligation. So, example, D borrowed 10,000 from C if C later agreed to kill X. Before D pays him, the condition to kill X is void but not the pre-existing obligation to D to pay C. Kasi may utang lang naman si D kay C. Pero nung nagkautang na siya, inutusan siya ni D na bago siya magbayad ay kailangan niyang patayin muna si X. So, Article 1184, the condition that some event happen at a determinate time shall extinguish the obligation as soon as the time expired, or if it has become indivisible, that event will not take place. So, it refers to positive or suspensive condition that happening of an event at a determinate time. So, the obligation is extinguished as soon as the time expires without the event taking place, or as soon as it has become indubitable that the event will not take place, although the time specific has not expired. So, example, X obliges himself to give B 10,000 pesos if B will marry C before B reaches the age of 23. So, kunyari, magiging liable lang yung ibibigay ni X kay B kung papakasalan ni B si C before siya mag-23. Pero kung na-reaches na niya yung edad ng 23 or above, ay magiging liable na ito dahil ang usapan lamang naman nila ay before ma-reaches ni B ang edad na 23. Article 1185, the condition that some event will not happen at a determinate time shall render the obligation effective from the moment the time indicated that elapsed, or if it has become embittered that the event cannot occur. If no time has been fixed, the condition shall be deemed fulfilled at such time as may have probably been contemplated, bearing in mind the nature of the obligation. So, this one is about negative condition. Yung sa Article 1184 is positive condition. The provisions speak of a negative condition that an event will not happen at a determinate time. The obligation shall become effective and binding. from the moment the time indicated has elapsed without the event taking place, or from the moment it has become invented that the event cannot occur although the time indicated has not yet elapsed. So, if no time is fixed, the circumstance should be considered to arrive at the intention of the parties. These rules may also be applied to positive condition. So, puntahan natin yung example para malaman natin kung ano nga ba talagang pinagkaibahan ng positive condition to negative condition. So, ang example ng negative condition is X bind himself to give B 10,000 pesos if B is not yet married to C on December 30. So, si X is not liable kay B if si B ay nagpakasal na agad kay C on December 30 or prior to. So, yung magiging liable lamang si X to B if on December 30 B is not married to C, hindi pa siya nagpapakasal kay C, and B married C after ng December 30. In the latter cases, the condition is fulfilled upon the expiration of the time indicated, which in December 30. So, Article 1186, the condition shall be deemed fulfilled when the obliger voluntarily prevents its fulfillment. So, it's talk about the constructive fulfillment of suspensive condition. So, constructive kasi wala namang actual na fulfillment by the debtor. So, meron tayong 3 requisites for the application of this article. So, first is the condition is suspensive. So, kung ang condition mo ay resolutory, so, applicable to apply. So, second, the obliger actually prevents the fulfillment of the condition. Yung obliger is pine-prevent niya ito para hindi mangyari yung condition at hindi siya maging liable. Third is he acts voluntary. So, it is very important kasi dapat voluntary yung pagpe-prevent niya. So, the law does not require that the obliger acts with malice or fraud as long as his purpose is to prevent the fulfillment of the condition. He should not to be allowed to profit from his own fault or bad faith. So, example, X agreed to give Y a 5,000 pesos commission if the latter could sell the former's land at certain price. Y bought a buyer who definitely decided to buy the property upon the terms prescribed by X. To invite the payment of the commission agree upon, X himself sold to the buyer the property at a lower price without the aid of the buyer. So, sa cases na to is sinasabi na the due performance by Y is undertaking. So, the condition ng payment ng commission ay purposely prevented ni X and it is deemed fulfilled. So, Article 1187, kung babasahin to, it is something to do the retroactive effects of the fulfillment of the suspensive condition. So, ano nga ba ang retroactive? So, ang retroactive ay nagbabalik tanaw sa nakaraan. So ang retroactive effects of fulfillment of suspensive conditions. So, first, in obligation to give, an obligation to give subject to a suspensive condition becomes demandable only upon the fulfillment of the condition. However, once the condition is fulfilled, its effect shall retroact to the day when the obligation was continuous. So, in this case na malinaw na need na ma-differentiate natin yung demandability of obligation at yung retroactive effects. So, meaning the obligation to give is will not be demandable na nangyari na yung suspensive condition, ang effect niya ay may retroactive. Ayan yung meaning na batas na condition is an accidental of a contract. So, number 2, in obligation to do or not to do with respect to the retroactive effects of the fulfillment of a suspensive condition, in obligation to do or not to do, not fixed rules is provided. So, kung obligation to give may retroactive upon the constitution of the obligation, so sa in obligation to do or not to do, ang rules natin dito ay no fixed rule is provided. Pero pwede naman na i-apply ang principle of retroactive and ma-applyan ng courts taking to consideration that have the obligation and intent of the parties. To determine in each cases the retroactive effects of the suspensive condition that has been complied with. Article 1188. The creditor may, before the fulfillment of the condition brings that appropriate action for the preservation of his right, the debtor may recover what during the same time he has paid by mistake in case of a suspensive condition. It say that pending of the fulfillment of the suspensive condition, the parties have the right to present their rights. So, as rights pending fulfillment of suspensive condition, they have two rights of creditor and the rights of debtor. So, first right of creditor, he may take or bring appropriate action for the preservation of his right, as the debtor may render nugatory the obligation upon the happening of the condition. So, example, I will give you a 500 pesos prohibited you pass the exam. So, hindi ka pa nakakapasa ng exam. So, paano mo ma-profited yung rights mo as creditor? Sabi nga, annotate on the title to the property in the registry to be of needs, or the annotate the obligation of the certificate title. Number 2, rights of debtor. He is entitled to recover what he paid by mistake prior to the happening of the suspensive condition. These rights granted to the debtor because the creditor may or may not be able to fulfill the condition imposed, and hence it is not certain that the obligation will arise. So, example, I will give you a 500 pesos prohibited you pass the exam. By mistake, akala ko nakapasa ka na, kaya binigyan na kita ng 500 pesos, pero hindi pa pala. So, sa Article 1189, so, kung babasahin doon is sinasabi doon ay requisite of the Article 1188. So meron tayong requisites for application of Article 1189. The obligation is a real obligation. Real obligation is obligation to give or to deliver. Number 2, the object is a specific or determinate things. Number 3, the obligation is subject to a suspensive condition. Number 4, the condition is fulfilled. And last, number 5, there is loss, deterioration, or improvement of the things during the pendency of the condition. So, may pinag-uusapan tayo ng loss pagdating sa loss, deterioration, or improvement of the things. Again, sa requisite, dapat alam mo kung ano ang real obligation, specific or determinating, and suspensive condition. sa rules in cases of loss, deterioration, or improvement of things during pendency of suspensive condition. So, meron tayong 6. Number 1, loss of things without debtor's fault. So, walang kasalanan si debtor, meaning fortuitous event ito. So, hindi liable. So, number 2, loss of things to debtor's fault. So, meron ng fault si debtor, kaya ang resulta ay loss of things. Dito, wala ng fortuitous event, kaya liable. Number 3, deterioration of things without debtor's fault. A thing's deterioration when its value is reduced or impaired with or without the fault of the debtor. Na kanina kasi dun sa mga loss ay yun yung mga nawawala. Ngayon, dito naman sa number 3, ito yung mga na-aksidente, ganun. So, example dito sa number 3 is if the car figure in accident as a result of which its windshield was broken and some of its panes were scratches away without the fault of X, thereby presuming its value to 90,000, Y will have the suffer the deterioration or impairment in the amount of 10,000 pesos. So, ang rules dito is creditor should suffer the deterioration if the same is not due to the debtor's fault. Number 4, deterioration of things through debtor fault. So, dito meron tayong, in these cases, may pagpipiliin tayo, retribution or fulfillment. So, ano nga bang retribution? The obligation with damages in these cases liable to pay 100,000 pesos. So, the value of the car before is deterioration plus accidental damages, if any. Pag fulfillment naman of the obligation also with damages. So, in these cases, is bound to give the car and pay 10,000 pesos plus incidental damages in any. So, 5th, improvement by nature of by time. A thing is improvement its value increase or enhanced by nature of by time or at the expenses of the debtor and creditor. So, example, suppose the market value of the car increase, who gets the benefits? The improvement shall endure to benefits inasmuch. So, number 6, improvement of things at the expense of debtor. During the pendency of the condition, had the car painted and its set cover changed at expenses. In these cases, will have the right granted to act supervisory with respect to improvement made on the things held in as usufruct. So, Article 1190. These cases is talked about the effects of the fulfillment of resolutory condition. So, effects of fulfillment of resolutory condition. 1 is in obligation to give when the resolutory condition in an obligation to give is fulfilled, the obligation is extinguished, and the parties are obliged to return to each other what they received under the obligation. Number 2, in obligation to do or not to do in such obligation, the court shall determine the retroactive effect of the fulfillment of the resolutory condition, as in this case, where the condition is suspensive. So, Article 1191, the power to resign the obligation is implied to rest precautioned once in cases of the obligor should not comply with what is incumbent upon him. The injured party may choose between the fulfillment and the rescission of the obligation with the payment of damages. In either cases, he may also seek restoration even after he has chosen fulfillment if the latter should become impossible. The court shall decree the restitution claim unless there be just cause authorized the fixing of a period. This is understood to be without prejudice to rights of the person who has acquired the things in accordance with Article 1385 and 1388 and the mortgage law. So, kinds of obligation according to the person obliged. So, meron tayong dalawa. So, unilateral and bilateral. So, unilateral is when only one party is obliged to comply with a pretension. So, it is usually about to contract of loan or donation. So, the lender has the obligation to give. After the lender has complied with his obligation, the debtor has the obligation to pay. So, ang bilateral naman is when both parties are mutually bound to each other. In other words, both parties are debtors and creditors of each bilateral. Bilateral obligation may be reciprocal or non-reciprocal. So, sa bilateral naman, may tinatawag tayong reciprocal obligation and non-reciprocal obligation. So, ano nga ba yun? A reciprocal obligation are those which arise from the cause and which each party is debtor and creditor of the other. So, isa lang ang control of sales, pero both parties are usually bound to comply. Sa non-reciprocal obligation naman are those which not impose simultaneous and correlative performance on both parties. Dito is dalawa ang control of sales. So, Article 1192, in cases both parties have committed a breach of the obligation, the liability of the first infractor should be equitably tempered by the court if it cannot be determined which of the parties first violated, and contrast the same should be deemed extinguished and it should be his own damages. So, dito is both parties are guilty of breach. So, ano nga ba yun? So, meron tayong dalawa sa paano natin malalaman kung yun ba ay both parties are guilty of breach. Ito, first infractor is to know one party violated this obligation, subsequently the others violated this party of the obligations. In these cases, the liability of the first infractor should be equitably reduced. So, malinaw na alam natin na liable yung first infractor kasi kita naman, pero i-reduce mo kasi magkakaroon din ng violation ang parties just per na itatempered ng court. So, yung court yung magte-tempered nun. So, number 2 is first infractor cannot be determined. So, one party violated this obligation followed by the other, but it cannot be determined which of them was the first infractor. So, dito is kanya-kanya na lang. Kasi di naman natin alam kung sino ang unang nagloko dahil di mo talaga alam. So, yan.
Section 2. Obligation with the period. Under Article 1193, it says, obligation for whose fulfillment a day certain has been fixed should be demandable only when that day comes. Obligation with a resolutory period take effects at once but terminate upon arrival of the day certain. A day certain is understood to be that which must necessarily come, although it may not be known when. If the uncertainty consists in whether the day will come or not, the obligation is conditional and it should be regulated by the rules of proceeding section. Meaning of obligation with the period. An obligation with the period is one whose effects or consequences are subjected in one way or another to the expiration or arrival of a said period or term. It says that the obligation in a work or in a task may expire or terminate if the given deadline or a given period of time comes. Next is
Meaning of period or term. A period is future and certain event upon the arrival of which the obligation or right subject to it either arises or it terminates. It is a day certain which must necessarily come, although it may not be known when, like the death of a person. It says that a period is a future. The given deadline of an obligation or work in may took place is most believable one. Example, not because you want to finish a certain task early, that's why you will give a short period of time to do so. But what if their task is to build a building and your given period of time is only 2 days? Is that believable to build a building in 2 days? Of course it's not. That's why giving a period of certain obligation may be believable and possible to do a work. Giving a certain period of task or project must be necessarily come, although hindi alam kung kailan ang exact date of the deadline. Period and condition distinguish. The difference as follows. 1. As to fulfillment. 2. As to time. 3. As to influence and an obligation. 4. As to effect when left to debtor's will. 5. As to retroactivity of effects. First, as to fulfill. It means a period is a certain event which must happen sooner or later at a date known beforehand or at a time which cannot be determined, while a condition is an uncertain event. Two, as to time, it means a period refers only to the future, while a condition may refer also to a past event unknown to the parties. 3. As to influence on the obligation, a period merely fixed the time for the efficiousness of the obligation. If suspensive, it cannot prevent the birth of obligation in due time. If resolutory, it does not invalidate the fact that the obligation exists. On the other hand, a condition causes an obligation either to arise or to cease. As to effect when left to debtor's will, it means a period which depends upon the will of the debtor empowers the court to fix the duration thereof rather, while a condition which depends upon the will rather or the debtor invalidates the obligation. And last, as to retroactive of effects, unless there is an agreement to the contrary, the arrival of a period does not have any retroactive effects, while the happening of the condition has retroactive effects. Like a condition in Article 1183 rather, a period must be possible. Posibleng gawin. Yung deadline ay dapat possible na magagawa in certain task or a certain project with a given deadline. It says a period must be possible. If the period is impossible, the obligation is void. Totoo naman, if the period or the deadline is possible, and if the period is impossible, hindi makatotohanan yung given deadline, pwedeng yung obligation ay hindi magagawa. Kinds of period or term. 1. According to effect. 2. According to sources. 3. According to definiteness. First, according to effect, there is 2. Suspensive period and resolutory period. Let's go on suspensive period. Suspensive period, the obligation begins only from a day certain upon the arrival of a period. Example, I will support you from the time your father dies. Here's the uncertainty event is whether the day death will come or not, but only in the exact date or time of its taking place. And if that day comes, my obligation will take place. If only the death of her father comes, saka ko may bibigay yung obligation na sinabi ko doon. So next, resolutory period. Resolutory period, the obligation is valid up to a day certain and terminates upon arrival of a period. Example, I will give you an allowance every week until the end of the month. Here it's given the deadline how long or where to stop the obligation. It will be terminate until the period of the time will come. So next, according to sources, there is 3. 1. Legal period, 2. Conventional or voluntary period, and last, judicial period. Legal period is when it is provided for the laws, meaning the period of a certain task may be legal when it provided by the laws. Letter B, conventional or voluntary period, when it agreed to the parties. Ito naman is when both parties agree to the certain period they give, a certain deadline upon project give. It's called conventional or voluntary period. Judicial period naman is when it fixed by the court. It says that this period is maybe controversial, that's why the court was the one who fixed the period of time or the deadline of a certain task here, and it's called judicial period. And the last, according to definiteness, there is 2, definite period and indefinite period. The definite period is when it's fixed or it is known when it will come. Ito naman, definite period, alam kung kailan dapat tapusin ang isang project o kailan dapat ipasa ito. May tamang date and time kung kailan ang deadline for a certain task. Or the other hand, the deadline or the period of time given in the certain task or project was given and known by the obligee, that is fixed and known when it comes. Yung indefinite period naman is kabaliktaran, when it is not fixed or it is not known when it will come, where the period is not fixed but the period is intended. The courts are usually empowered by law to fix the same. Dito naman, ang indefinite period ay hindi fixed ang period na or deadline of a certain task. Ibig sabihin, walang proper date or time na given to submit na certain task, kaya it is not known when it come. Article 1194. In case of loss, deterioration, or improvement of the thing before the arrival of the day certain, the rules in Article 1189 should be observed. Article 1195. Anything paid or delivered before the arrival of the period, the obligor being unaware of the period or believing that the obligation has become due the demandable, may be recovered with the fruits and interest. Payment before arrival of period, according to Article 1195, applies only to obligation to give. It is similar to Article 1188, Paragraph 2, which allows the recovery of what has been paid by mistake before the fulfillment of a suspensive condition. The creditor cannot unjustly enrich himself by retaining the thing or money received before the arrival of the period. Debtor presumed aware of period. The presumption, however, is that the debtor knew that the debt was not yet due. He has the burden of proving that he was unaware of the period, where the duration of the period depends upon the will of the debtor. Payment by him amounts in effect to use a determination of the arrival of the period. The obligor may not no longer recover the thing or money once the period has arrived, but can recover the fruits or interest thereof from the date of the term premature performance to the date of maturity of the obligation. Example: Micah owns a YESA 10,000 pesos which was supposed to be paid on December 31 in this year. By mistake, Micah paid his obligation on December 31 last year. Assuming that today is June 30, Micah can recover the 10,000 pesos rather, plus 600 pesos, which is the interest from 1/2 year at the legal rate of 12%, or a total of 10,600 pesos. But Micah cannot recover except the interest if the debt had already matured. Neither can there be a right to recover if Micah had knowledge of the period. The theory under Solutio Indebiti obviously will not apply. Micah is deemed to have impliedly renounced the period. No recovery in personal obligation. Article 1195 has no application to do because as to the former, it is physically impossible to recover the service rendered, and as to the latter, as the obligor performs by not doing, he cannot, of course, recover what he has not done. Article 1196. Whenever in an obligation a period is designated, it is presumed to have been established for the benefit of both the creditor and the debtor, unless from the tenor of the same or other circumstances it should appear that the period has been established in favor of one or the another. Presumption as to benefit of period. In an obligation subject to a period fixed by the parties, the period is presumed to have been established for the benefit of both the creditor and debtor. This means that before the expiration of the period, the debtor may not fulfill the obligation, and neither may the creditor demand its fulfillment without the consent of the other, especially if the latter will be prejudiced or inconvenienced thereby. The presumption, of course, is reputable. Example: on January 1, Micah borrowed from YESA 10,000 pesos payable on December 31 at 15% interest. Micah cannot pay before December 31 without the consent of YESA. Neither can YESA compel Micah to pay before the expiration of the term. It is presumed that the period designated, which is December 31, has been established for the benefit of both. Micah's benefit because he can use the money for 1 year. YESA is also benefit because of the interest the money would earn for 1 year. In the contract of loan with interest, the term is generally for the benefits of both the lender and the borrower. This is also the case even where there is no interest stipulated, but where under the contract, the creditor receives, in place of interest, other benefits by reason of the period. Obviously, in the above example, Micah can pay YESA before December 31 provided the payment includes the interest of 1 year. Where the obligation of Micah is to deliver, say 100 bags of rice, YESA cannot be compelled to accept performance before the expiration of the period, especially if he would be prejudiced or inconvenienced thereby. Exception to the general rule. The tenor of the obligation or the circumstances may, however, show that it was the intention of the parties to constitute the period of the benefits of either the debtor or the creditor. The benefits of the period may be the subject of express stipulation of the parties. 1. Term is from the benefit of the debtor alone. It says that he cannot be compelled to pay prematurely, but he can, if he desires to do so. Example, Micah borrowed from Ayesa 1,000 pesos to be paid within 1 year without interest. In this case, the period of 1 year should be deemed intended for the benefits of Micah only. Therefore, he can pay any time, but he cannot be compelled to pay before 1 year. Another example, Stephanie promised to pay his debt on or before December 31, 2008. Here, the payment is to be made within a stipulated period. Stephanie can pay before said date. Another example, Jessa promised to pay his debt from a term of 5 years counted from this date. It has been held that the debt is yet payable within 5 years. Number 2. Term is for the benefits of the creditor. It says he may demand fulfillment even before the arrival of the term, but the debtor cannot require him to accept payment before the expiration of the stipulated period. Example, Jessa borrowed from Lady Lynn 1,000 pesos payable on December 31 with the stipulation that Jessa cannot make payment before the lapse of the period, but Lady Lynn may demand fulfillment even before said date. Here, Lady Lynn can demand payment at any time, but Jessa cannot shorten the 1 year period without the consent of Lady Lynn. Ordinarily, there must be a stipulation granting the benefits of the term to only the creditor. Computation of terms or period, the Administrative Code of 1987, however, provides legal periods. It says year should be understood to be 12 calendar months of 30 days unless it refers to a specific calendar month, in which case it should be computed according to the number of days the specific month contains day to a day for 24 hours and night from a sunset to sunrise. A calendar month is a month designated in the calendar without regard to the number of days it may contain. It is the period of the time running from the beginning to a certain number day up to, but not if there is not sufficient number of days in the next month, then up to and including the first day of the month. To illustrate one calendar month from December 31, 2010 will be from January 1, 2011 to January 31, 2011. One calendar month from January 31, 2011 will be from February 1, 2011 until February 28, 2011. Under Administrative Code, a year is composed of 12 calendar months, the number of days being irrelevant. Article 1197. If the obligation does not fix a period, but from its nature and circumstances, it can infer that the period was intended. The courts may fix the duration thereof. The court shall also fix the duration of the period when it depends upon the will of the debtor. In every case, the court shall determine which period has may under the circumstances has been probably completed by the parties. Once fixed by the courts, the periods cannot be changed by them. Court generally without power to fix a period. It says the period mentioned in the above probably refers to a judicial period as distinguished from the period fixed by the parties in their contract which is known as contractual period, if the obligation does not state a period and no period is intended, the court is not authorized to fix a period. The courts have no right to make contracts for the parties. Example: Stephanie obliges himself to pay Lady Lin 10,000 pesos. Since the obligation does not fix a period, not even the court may fix a period. It says the reason is because the contract is the law between the parties and its terms cannot be changed by the court. Exemptions to the general rule. Under Article 1197, there are two cases when the court is authorized to fix the duration of the period. Article 1197 is part and a parcel of all obligation. In contemplated therein, hence, whenever the court fixes the term of an obligation, it does not thereby amend or modify the same. It merely enforces or carries out the intention of the parties. It cannot arbitrarily fix a period out of the thin air. Number 1. No period is fixed, but a period was intended. It says the obligation does not fix a period, but it can be intended from its nature and circumstances that a period was intended. Example: Ayesa agreed to construct the house of Micah. The parties failed to fix the period within which the construction is to be made. Here, the court can fix the term, for it is evident that the parties intended that Ayesa should construct the house within a certain period. Number 2. Two examples. Lady Lin brought lumber from the store of Stephanie on credit. The period for payment in the invoice is left blank. From the nature of the obligation, it cannot be inferred that the period is intended. Next example. Jesus sold the parcel of land to Lady Lin with the right of repurchase. No term is specified in the contract of the exercise of the right. The court is authorized to fix the period. 2. Duration of period depends upon the will of the debtor. The court must fix the duration of the period to forestall the possibility that the obligation may never be fulfilled. In fixing the term, the court is merely enforcing the implied stipulation of the parties. Legal effects wherein suspensive period condition depends upon will of debtor. 1. The existence of the obligation is not affected, although the period depends upon the sole will all of the debtor. It is only the performance with respect to time that is left to the will of the debtor. 2. If the obligation is subject to a condition which depends upon the sole will of the debtor, the condition obligation is void, according to Article 1192, because in such case, it's actually the fulfillment of the obligation that depends upon the will of the debtor. Period fixed cannot be changed by the courts. Number 1. If there is a period agreed upon and it has already lapsed, the court cannot fix another period. Number 2. From the very moment the parties give their acceptance and consents to the period fixed by the court, said period acquires the nature of a contract because the effect of such acceptance and consent by the parties is exactly the same as if they have expressly agreed upon it, and having been agreed upon by them, it becomes a law governing their contract. However, the parties may modify the term by new agreement.
So hi, I'm Micah San Pedro and I will continue the discussion of AYESA Babad to Article 1198. So Article 1198, the debtor shall lose every right to make use of the period. First, when after the obligation has been contracted, he becomes insolvent unless he gives a guarantee or security for the debt. Second, when he does not furnish to the creditor the guarantees or securities which he has promises. Third, when by his own acts he has impaired sale, guarantees, or security after their event they disappear, unless the immediately gives new ones equally satisfactory. Fourth, when the debtor violates any undertaking in consideration of which the creditor agreed to the period. Fifth, when the debtor attempts to abscond. So, this article is talk about the obligation condemned before lapse of period. So, is that the obligation is not demandable before the lapse of the period in any case mentioned in Article 1198. The debtor shall lose every right to make use of the period that is the period is distracted and the obligation becomes pure and therefore immediately demandable. The exceptions are based on the fact that the debtor might not be able to comply with his obligation. So, yung one is when the debtor becomes insolvent. So, ang example doon, kunwari, si Jessa owns on Stephanie 10,000 pesos due in payable December. If Jessa becomes insolvent, say, on September 10, Stephanie can demand immediately payment from Jessa, even before majority unless gives sufficient guarantee or security. So, the insolvent in this case, need not be juridically declared. It is a suspension that the assets of Jessa are less than his liabilities, or Jessa is unable to pay his debt as they matured. So take note that insolvency of Jessa must occur after that obligation is being contracted. Number 2, when debtor does not furnish guarantee or security promise. Example, suppose in the same example of Jessa promised to mortgage his house to secure the debt. If the fails to furnish say security as promised, he should lose his right. He should lose his right to the period. So third, when guarantees or security gives have been impaired or has disappeared. Example, if debt is security by a mortgage on the house of Jessa, but the house was burned through his fault, the obligation also becomes demandable unless Jessa gives a new security equally satisfactory. In these cases naman, the house needs not totally destroyed, as it suspension that the security be impaired by the act of Jessa. But in cases of fortuitous event, it is required that security must be disappear. So, nabanggit natin niyon sa past article. So, if the security gives deteriorate is in such a matter as to become exclusory, it must be deemed to have disappeared to laws contemplated in paragraph 3. If the debt is secured by a bond, the failure of Jessa to renew the bond or replace it an equivalent guarantee upon it expiration will likewise gives Stephanie the right to demand immediate payment. So, when debtor violates an undertaking. So, example, now suppose the Stephanie agreed to the period in consideration of the promise of Jessa to repair a piano of Stephanie. The violation of this undertaking by Jessa gives Stephanie the right to demand the immediately payment of the loan. So, fifth, when the debtor attempts to abscond. Example, before the due date of the obligation of Jessa, change his address without informing Stephanie. And with the intention of escaping from his obligation, this act of Jessa is a sign of bad faith which result in the loss of his right to benefits of the period stipulated. Observe that a mere attempt or intent to abscond is suspension.
Hi, for today I'm going to discuss the Section 3 Alternative Obligation. In Article 1199, a person alternatively bound by different prestations shall completely perform one of them. Also, the creditor cannot be compelled to receive part of one and part of the other undertaking. Article 1131. So, sa alternative obligation, sinasabi dyan na pag umutang ka, kunwari pera ang inutang mo, maaari ka magbayad ng mga ari-arian as long as napag-usapan niyo siya nung pinag-utangan mo. So, now, we're going to proceed the kinds of obligation according to object. First, we have simple obligation. In simple obligation, it means one prestation. For example, D promise to repair the car of C. Wala na siyang ibang binanggit pa kundi yun lang. Yun ang ibig sabihin ng simple obligation. Second obligation is compound obligation. In this obligation, there are two several prestation. It may be A. Conjunctive obligation. Dito sa conjunctive obligation, may dalawa o higit pang prestation na napag-usapan. Example, D promise to deliver to C a 2010 model BMW car and a dump truck. 2 yung pinangako niya, kaya 2 ang binigay niya. B. Distributive obligation. Dito naman, several prestation but only one or some of the prestation are due. Two kinds of distributive obligation. First is the alternative where several prestations are due but the performance of one is sufficient. Article 1199. For example, D promised to deliver to C either a BMW car, a Jaguar, or Mercedes-Benz. Tatlo yung pinagpipilian pa ni debtor kung ano yung ibibigay niya. So, the second naman is facultative obligation where only one prestation is due but the debtor may substitute another. Article 1206. For example, D promised to deliver C a BMW but D may deliver a Jaguar substitute. So, the BMW is the original prestation and the Jaguar a substitute. Let's move on to the definition of alternative obligation. Alternative obligation are various prestations that are due. And the general rule belongs to the debtor. For example, ako yung umutang ng pera, tapos hindi ko siya mabayaran, pwede ako sa kanya mag-alok ng ibang bagay na pwede ko sa kanyang ibayad. For example, bahay, lupa. And to simply understand this, from the root word na alternative, ibig sabihin pamalit. Article 1200, the right of choice belongs to the debtor unless it has been expressly granted to the creditor. The right of choice as rule given to the debtor, syempre yung kapag niya rin mamili ng ipapamalit ay nakay debtor. And of course, the debtor shall have no right to choose those prestations which are impossible. Bawal mangako si debtor ng mga bagay or mga object na imposibleng mangyari sa realidad. Pangalawa, unlawful, yung mga bawal sa batas. Examples, drugs. And the three could not have been the object of the obligation. For example, 3,000 yung utang niya, tapos yung ipapalit niya is nasa 1,000 lang. Hindi niya na-meet yung object of obligation. And therefore, only one prestation is practicable. Kunwari, nangako ako ng 3 bagay sa sa creditor. For example, a house, a lot, and a car. Article 1201. The choice shall produce no effect except from the time it has been communicated. 1133. Communication of notice that choice has been made. 1. Effect of notice. Until the choice is made and communicated, the obligation remains alternative. 2. Proof and form of notice. The burden of proving that such communication has been made is upon who made the choice. The law does not require any particular from regarding the giving of notice. Article 1203. If through the creditor's acts, the debtor cannot make a choice according to the terms of the obligation, the latter may rescind the contract with damages. Article 1204. The creditor shall have a right to indemnity for damages when, through the fault of the debtor, all the things which are alternatively the object of the obligation have been lost, or the compliance of the obligation has become impossible. Effect of loss of objects of obligation. 1. Sum of the objects. Pag yung sum of the objects nawala ni debtor, pwede pa niyang ibigay yung ibang obligation sa creditor. 2. All of the objects. Pag lahat ng pinangako niya, lahat ng obligation niya is nawala or hindi niya na pwedeng gawin, pwede siyang magbayad na bayad pinsala sa creditor. And the basis of indemnity or bayad pinsala is pag hindi mo na kayang ibigay yung pinangako mo kasi aksidenteng nawala, or yung 2, or imposible na siyang ma-perform tong service yon. Article 1205. When the choice has been expressly given to the creditor, the obligation shall cease to be alternative from the day when the selection has been communicated to the debtor. In the right of choice belongs to creditor. Before the creditor makes the selection, the debtor cannot incur in delay. Rules in case of loss before creditor has made a choice. 1. When a thing is lost through a fortuitous event. 2. When a thing is lost through debtor's fault. 3. When all the things are lost through debtor's fault. 4. When all the things are lost through a fortuitous event. Rules applicable to personal obligations. The responsibility of the debtor for damages depends upon whether the cause which he rendered the obligation impossible due to his fault or not. Article 1206. When only one prestation had been agreed upon, but the obligor may render another in substitution, for the obligation is called facultative. Sa nauna na, in-explain ko na kung ano ang facultative. Ang facultative ay ang pagpapalit ng substitute obligation. For example, the original prestation is the BMW car and the substitute prestation is the Jaguar. So, since hindi available yung BMW, so the debtor will substitute the Jaguar car for the loss nung BMW.
Hello everyone, I'm Lady Linay Dakara and today po i-discuss ko po sa inyo ang Section 4, Joint and Solidary Obligation. So, ano po ba ang nakapaloob sa topic na ito? Dito po is merong 15 articles. So, unahin na po natin ang Article 1207 and 1208. So, Article 1207, the concurrence of two or more creditors or of two or more debtors in the same obligation does not imply that each one of the former has a right to demand, or that each of one of the latter is bound to render entire compliance with the prestation. There is solidary liability when the obligation expressly so states, or when the law or the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. So, dito po, ang ibig sabihin po nito is tinatalakay po dito yung joint and solidary. Sabihin po ng Article 1207, it deals with plurality of subjects. Meaning, maraming debtors and creditors. Next is Article 1208. If from the law or the nature of the wording of obligation to which the preceding article refers, the contrary does not appear, the credit or debt shall be presumed to be divided into many equal share as there are creditors or debtors. The credits or debt being considered distinct from one another, subject to the rules of court governing the multiplicity of suits. So, dito po kapag may two or more creditors or debtors is ang presumption niya is the obligation is joint. Next po is kind of obligations according to the number of parties. Individual obligation po, one where there is only one obligor or one obligee. So, ang ibig sabihin po nito is meron lang pong isang debtor or obligor and meron ding isang creditor or obligee. Next po is collective obligation. One, where there are two or more debtors and two or more creditors. It may be joint or solidary. So, ano po ba ang meaning ng joint and solidary obligations? Joint obligation or one where the whole obligation is to be paid or fulfilled proportionately by the different debtors or is to be demanded proportionately by the different creditors. dito po is kung ano lang yung part mo, yun lang po yung babayaran mo. Kasi po, pwede po ditong tandaan is to each his own. Kung ano lang po yung part mo, halimbawa may 50-50 po sa hatian, na umutang ka, yung 50% po, yun lang po yung babayaran mo. Yung 50%, another 50% is doon naman po sa kasama mong umutang. Next po is solidary obligation, or one where each of the debtors is bound to render and each one of the creditors has right to demand from any of the debtors entire compliance with the prestation. So, dito po sa solidary obligation is one for all for one. So, ano po ba ang mangyayari kapag ang collective obligation presumed to be joint? First is, if A is liable to B for 9,000, there can be no problem regarding to the determination of the following. A, the person liable to pay. B, the person entitled to demand payment. C, the extent of the liability of the debtor. And last po is the extent of the right of the creditor. Second po is where there is plurality of parties, 2 or more debtors or 2 or more creditors. And the share of each in the obligation is specified. The correlatives right of the obligation of the parties are known. So, example if A, B, and C are liable to D in the amount of 9,000, and it's stated that the corresponding share of each debtor is 3,000. So, si A, B, and C, sila po yung umutang. And C din naman is yung inutangan. We know that A, B, and C are liable only for 3,000. Yung pong si A, B, C is 3,000 lang yung, kada isa sa kanila is 3,000 lang yung utang kay D. So, D is not entitled to collect from each debtor more than his corresponding share in obligation. On the other hand, let us suppose that in the same obligation, the share of each debtor or the share of each creditor, if there are 2 or more creditors, is not specified. What is the extent of liability of A, B, and C? In such case, the presumption is that the obligation is joint. And as a consequences. Letter A, there are as many debts as there are debtors. B, there are as many credits as there are creditors. C, the debts and or credits are considered distinct and separate from each other. Letter D, each debtor is liable only for a proportionate part of debt. And letter E, each creditor is entitled only to a proportionate part of the credit. So, the presumption established in Article 1208 is rebutable. So, let's say for example, if ABC borrowed 9,000 from D, the presumption is that A, B, and C are jointly liable. There are 3 debts and 1 credit. D can demand only 3,000 each from A, B, C, or total of 9,000 pesos. Since the debt are distinct and separate from each other, the insolvency of one debtor shall not make the others liable. So, diba sabi ko nga po, kung ano lang yung part mo is yun lang yung babayaran mo. Di na pwedeng humangad si creditor ng hihigit pa. Kung 3,000 lang yung sayo, is 3,000 lang yung babayaran mo. Kasi meron naman iba pang debtors na magbabayad nung kulang. So, number 2 example is A borrowed from B and C and D, 9,000 pesos. Unless the contrary appears, the obligation is prime facie adjoint 1. In this case, there is 1 debt and 3 credits. Ikaw yung umutang tapos meron kang 3 inutangan. Each creditor can demand only 3,000 pesos from A. So, ikaw, si letter A, ang babayaran mo lang si letter B, C, and D ng tig 3,000 pesos. Pwede mo namang bayaran si letter B ng 9,000 pero si B is ibibigay niya yung 3,000 ay yung 6,000 kay C and D. Hindi niya pwedeng sarilihin yun kasi tatlo silang nagpautang sa'yo. Number 3 is A and B are liable to C and D for 9,000. The same presumption applies. There are 2 debts and 2 creditors. Each creditor can demand only 4,500 from either debtor. Of course, the total liability of A or B and the total collection of C or D cannot exceed to 4,500 pesos. So, yun po is kapag ang collective obligation presume to a joint obligation. So, next po is presumption subject to rules on multiplicity of suits. The presumption of Article 1208 is made subject to the rules court of governing the multiplicity of suits. Otherwise, situation may arise where there are as many suits as there are debtors and creditors. So, makikita po natin ito sa Section 3 for Rule number 2 and Section 6, Rule number 3, Rules of Court. The rules on multiplicity of suits seek to prevent the filing of 2 or more suits or complaints for a single cause of action or the same violation of the legal right of the plaintiff. So, ano po ba ang mga words used to indicate joint liability? Once po na makita or mabasa natin itong mga joints na to, is automatic, maalala natin is joint liability na yung example na yon. So, first is mancomunada. Second is mancomunadamente. Third is pro rata, proportionately, and we promise to pay. Signed by 2 or more person. So, ano naman po kapag ang obligation is solidary? Solidary is liability is not lightly inferred. Under Article 1207, there is solidary liability only when, first, the obligation expressly so states, or second, the law requires solidarity, or third, the nature of obligation requires solidarity. Solidary liability also exists when it is imposed in a final judgment against several defendants. So, ano naman yung mga words na makikita natin or maaalala natin kapag meron tayong ma-encounter na solidarity liability? Example niya is jointly or severally, solidaria in solidum together and or separately, individually and or collectively, juntus or separadamente, and I promise to pay, signed by 2 or more person. Po tayong kinds of solidarity according to the parties bound. Letter A is passive solidarity. Solidarity on the part of the debtors where any of one of them can be made liable for the fulfillment of the entire obligation. It is in the nature of mutual guarantee. Example, A and B are solidary debtors of C in the amount of 10,000 pesos. There is her only one debt, the debt of A and B in the amount of 10,000. And one credit, the credit of C in the amount of 10,000 against A and B. So, ang umutang is si A and si B kay C ng 10,000 pesos. So, C may demand payment from either A or B, or both of them simultaneously, of the whole obligation. Payment by A or B extinguishes the obligation, but A or B may claim from B or A the share which corresponds to him depending upon the agreement between them. So, si C pwedeng mag-demand ng bayad kay either kay A or B, or pwedeng parehas sa kanilang dalawa. So, in this case, C cannot collect more than 10,000, which is the extent of his credit. Active solidarity. Active solidarity, solidarity on the part of the creditors where any one of them can demand the fulfillment of the entire obligation. Its essential feature is that of mutual representation among the solidary creditors with power to exercise the rights of others in the same manner as their rights. So, dito sa kinds na to sa active solidarity is yung creditor or yung nagpautang, pwede siyang mag-demand ng whole obligation sa kahit sinong umutang sa kanya. So, let's say for example, A is liable for 10,000 in favor of B and C who are solidary creditors. So, dalawa yung nagpautang tapos si A yung umutang. A may pay either B or C. So, long as the entire debt is not paid, B and C can demand payment from A. If B or C receive payment, he is liable to C or B. Kung sino yung binayaran ni A ng payment, halimbawa si B, is liable siya kay C. Or kung si C naman yung binayaran ni A, C is liable naman siyang ibalik yung kalahati kay B. So, 50-50 lang lagi. So, the liability of A cannot exceed 10,000 pesos, which is the extent of his liability. So, diba pwede siyang sa A may utang nga, diba, 10,000. Dito sa active solidarity, kahit sino kay B or C, pwede niyang bayaran. So, halimbawa, pag binayaran niya si B, ibabalik niya yung 5,000 kay C. Kung si C naman yung binayaran ni A ng buong 10,000, ibabalik naman ni C yung sobrang 5,000 kay B. So, last kinds of solidarity is mixed solidarity. Solidarity on the part of the debtors and creditors, where each one of the debtors is liable to render, and each one of the creditor has a right to demand entire compliance with the obligation. Second is according to source. Letter A is conventional solidarity, where solidarity is agreed upon by the parties. Nakikita po ito sa Article 1306. If nothing is mentioned in the contract relating to solidarity, the obligation is only joint. So, next po is legal solidarity, where solidarity is imposed by the law. Where solidarity is imposed by nature of the obligation. Next is Article 1209. If the division is impossible, the right of the creditors may be prejudiced only by their collective acts, and the debt can be enforced only by proceeding against all the debtors. If one of the latter should be insolvent, the other shall not be liable for his share. So, dito po is, kapag yung creditor ay yung debtor is wala nang kakayahang magbayad ng utang niya, is tapos yung may kasama siyang umutang, hindi pwedeng bayaran ng buo nung isang umutang kasi hindi naman siya liable for his share. Diba kasi, sabi ko sa inyo, yung joint is kung ano yung part mo, is yun lang yung babayaran mo. So, next po is Article 12.10. The indivisibility of obligation does not necessarily give rise to solidarity, nor does solidarity of itself implies indivisibility. Indivisibility and solidarity distinguish. First, indivisibility refers to the prestation, while solidarity refers to the juridical or legal tie that binds tie. Second is, in indivisible obligation, only the debtor guilty of breach of obligation is liable for damages, while solidary obligation, all the debtors are liable for breach of obligation committed by a debtor. Third, indivisibility can exist although there is only one debtor and one creditor, while in solidarity, there must be at least two debtor or two creditors. And lastly, yung difference ng indivisibility and solidarity is, in indivisible obligation, the others are not liable in case of insolvency of one debtor, while in solidary obligation, the other debtors are proportionately liable. The first sentence in Article 12.10 simply means the liability in an indivisible obligation may be either joint or solidary. The second sentence means that in solidary obligation, the subject matter may be divisible or indivisible. Article 12.11. Solidarity may exist although the creditors and the debtors may not be bound in the same manner by the same periods and condition. So, meron tayo ditong kinds of solidary obligation according to the legal tie. First is uniform, and the second one is non-uniform or varied. So, the meaning of uniform, when the parties are bound by the same stipulation. And the non-uniform is when the parties are not subject to the same stipulation. Next is Article 12.12. Each one of the solidary creditors may do whatever may be useful to the others, but not anything which may be prejudicial to the latter. Next is Article 12.13. A solidary creditor cannot assign his rights without the consent of the other. Ano naman kaya yung assignment by solidary creditor of his right? So, in the absence of consent given by the others, a solidary creditor cannot assign his rights to a third person. The reason behind this prohibition is that each creditor represents the other and the assignee. It may not have the confidence of the original solidary creditors. Original solidary creditors, considering that the assignee after receiving payment may not give the share of the others. So if the assignment is made to the co-creditor, the consent of the other creditor is not necessary. So itong provision na to is talks about the solidarity creditors' right to assign. So, ang general rule, supposedly solidary credit or cannot assign. Yung exception naman is when other creditors consent, kasi nga, di ba, essentially solidarity obligation implies mutual agency and mutual confidence. Next is Article 12.14. The debtor may pay any one of the solidary creditors, but if any demand, judicial or extrajudicial, has been made by one of them, payment should be made to him. So, Article 12.14 is applicable not only in cases of active solidarity, but also where the solidarity is mixed. Although the singular debtor is employed in case of mixed solidarity. The debtor upon whom no demand has been made may pay any one of the solidary creditors. So, kung walang nagdemand sa creditor, kahit sino sa kanila is pwedeng bayaran ni debtor. So, example niya is A is liable to pay B and C, solidary creditors. So, B and C is solidary creditors and CA is debtor ng 10,000 pesos. In this case, A may pay either B or C. But if any one of B or C may demand, judicial or extrajudicial, is made, payment should be made either B or C. So, if A neitherless paid, sabihin na natin si C, 10,000 pesos, B is still entitled to his share from A in case C does not turn over to B the latter share. So, if B and C demanded payment at the same time, A may pay either one of them. So, if there are two or more debtors, only the debtor upon whom demanded had been made is bound to make payment to the creditor who made the demand. So, kapag may dalawang creditor daw, is kung sino lang yung nag-demand, kung sino nag-demand sa creditor, is yun yung babayaran ni debtor, kahit sino dun. Kahit sino sa debtor, kung sino yung nag-demand sa creditor, yun yung babayaran nila. Tapos yung creditor na nag-demand is ibibigay yung kalahati sa kasama niya. Ganon. Article 12.15, novation, compensation, confusion, or remission of debt is made by any of the solidary creditors or with any of the solidary debtors, shall extinguish the obligation without prejudice to the provision of the Article 1219. The creditor who may have executed any of these acts, as well as who collects the debt, shall be liable the others for the share in the obligation corresponding to them. So, liability of solidary creditor in case of novation, compensation, confusion, or remission. Example is A, debtor, and B, C, and D, solidary creditors in the amount of 30,000 pesos. If B validly condones the debt in the amount of 18,000 pesos, he or she shall be liable for 6,000 to each C and D. So, if B collects 15,000 from A, B must account for the 5,000 share each C and D. So, kapag si C or si B kumuha ng paunang bayad or humingi na ng bayad kay A ng 18,000, kailangan yung bigyan si C at D ng tig 6,000 pesos. Ganon. Makikita na doon ang obligation kasi hindi lang naman siya yung creditor. In Article 1216, the creditor may proceed against any one of solidary debtors or some or all of them simultaneously. The demand made against one of them shall not be an obstacle to those which may subsequently be directed against the other so long as the debt has not been fully collected. So, ano kaya yung right ng creditor to proceed against any solidary debtor? The above provision is not applicable to a joint obligation. It reiterates the rule that in the solidary obligation, any one or all of the solidary debtors simultaneously may be made to pay debt so long as it has not been fully collected. So, example, A, B, and C solidarily owe D the amount of 3,000. D can collect from A or B or C alone from any the two of them or all of them simultaneously. If demanded is made on A, kung si D ay nagdemand kay A, the latter cannot require D to make demand also in B and C, or to include them as party defendants, as D has the right to proceed against any one of them. So, if A pays D 1,000 pesos, the latter can still go against all of them for the balance as long as the debt has not been entirely satisfied. Yun. So, kung halimbawa, di ba, si A, sa kanya unang nagdemand si D na bayaran yung 3,000, hindi na pwedeng mag-demand kay B and C. Pero kung ang dinemand lang ni D kay A is 1,000, syempre, pwede pa siya mag-demand kay B and C ng tig 1,000. Kasi, obligation nilang bayaran si D. Kasi umutang sila dun eh. So, The next is Article 1217. Payment made by one of the solidary debtors extinguishes the obligation. If two or more solidary debtors offer to pay, the creditor may choose which to offer to accept. He or she who made the payment may claim from his co-debtors only the share which corresponds to each, the interest for the payment already made. If the payment is made before the debt is due, no interest for the intervening period may be demanded. So, when one of solidary debtors cannot, because of his insolvency, reimburse his share to the debtor paying the obligation, such share shall be borne by all his co-debtors in proportion to the debt of each. So, ano kaya yung effect ng payment by solidary debtor? First is between the solidary debtors and creditors. Payment made by one of solidary debtors extinguishes an obligation or the obligation. So, when speaking of payment that extinguishes an obligation, the law refers to payment in full. However, the creditor, for his protection, is given the right to choose which offer to accept if two or more solidary debtors offer to pay. Second one is among solidary debtors. After payment of the debt, the paying solidary debtor can demand reimbursement from his co-debtors for their proportionate share with legal interest only from the time of payment. So the third is among solidary creditors. The receiving creditor is jointly liable to others for their corresponding share. So next is Article 1218. Payment by a solidary debtor shall not entitle him to reimbursement from his co-debtors if such payment is made after the obligation has prescribed or become illegal. So, prescripted periods of action. So, ano naman yung mga action na to? By prescription, one acquires the ownership of the other rights through the lapse of time in the manner of under the condition laid down by the law. So, in the same rights and action are lost by prescription, Article 1106. So, dun natin siya makikita. So, the following action must be brought within 10 years from the time that the right of action accrues. First, upon written contract. Second, upon obligation created by law. And upon judgment, Article 1144. So, the following action must be commenced within 6 years. Yung una is 10 years. Yung pangalawa naman is 6 years. First is upon oral contract. Second, upon a quasi-contract. So, ito naman, yung, di ba yung mga prescription action kapag yung 10 years, yung una, 6. Next is, the following action must be instituted within 4 years. First, upon an injury to the rights of the plaintiff. Second is upon a quasi-delect. Next is Article 1219. The remission made by the creditor of the share which affects one of the solidary debtors not release the latter from his responsibility towards the co-debtors in case the debt had been made totally paid by any one of them before the remission was affected. Article 1220. The remission of the whole obligation obtained by one of the solidary debtors does not entitle him to reimbursement from his co-debtors. Article 1221. If the thing has been or lose, or if the prestation has become impossible without the fault of solidary debtors, the obligation shall be extinguished. If there was fault on the part of any one of them, all shall be responsible to the creditor for the price and payment of damages and interest without prejudice to their action against the guilty or negligent debtor. If through a fortuitous event the thing is lost or the performance has become impossible after one of solidary debtors has incurred in delay through the judicial or extrajudicial demand upon him by the creditor. So, the provision of the preceding paragraph shall apply. So, meron tayo ditong tatlong kinds. So, first is loss is without fault and before delay. So, ang example nito is if A, B, and C promise solidary to deliver to a particular tract valued 15,000, the obligation shall be extinguished. A tract is lost or destroyed through a fortuitous event, the fault of A and B and C, and before they have incurred in delay. So, di ba hindi naman kasalanan or hindi naman sinasadya kasi na may nangyari na wala yung track because of the fortuitous event. So, pangalawa is loss is due to fault on the part of a solidary debtor. So, ito naman, ang example naman dito is it in the preceding example. So, kung yung naunang example, the track was lost through the fault of C, A, and B, shall also be responsible to D for the price of the track as well as damages, although A and B were not at fault at all. A solidary obligation is, in essence, a mutual agency as far as the creditor is concerned. The fault or delay of one solidary debtor shall be fault or delay of all the solidary debtors. So, number 3 is loss. Loss is without fault but after delay. So, example, if the track was lost through the fortuitous event, but after a demand of C was made, they can still recover damages from A or B, or both of them, without prejudice to the right of action of the latter against C, following the same rule. So, the default by C makes all of the solidary debtors responsible even for a fortuitous event. 1222. A solidary debtor may, in actions filed by the creditor, avail himself of all defenses which are derived from the nature of the obligation and those which are personal to him or pertain to his own share, with respect to those which personally belong to the others. He may avail himself thereof only as regards that part of the debt for which the latter are responsible.
Hi, I'm Micah San Pedro and I will discuss the Section 5 and Section 6. So first, I will discuss the Section 5, Article 1223 to Article 1225. Article 1223, the divisibility or indivisibility of the things that are the object of obligation in which there is only one debtor and only one creditor does not alter or modify the provision of Chapter 2 of this title. So, it's talk about the divisible and indivisible obligation. So, what is the meaning of divisible and indivisible obligation? First, a divisible obligation is when the object of which is its labor or performance is capable of partial fulfillment. So, example natin dito, to deliver 200 kilos of sugar. Indivisible obligation is one of the object of which is its deliver or performance is not capable of partial fulfillment. So, ang example natin dito is to deliver a specific car. May test of distinction tayo. In determining whether an obligation is divisible or not, the controlling circumstance is not possibility or impossibility of partial presentation, but the purpose of the obligation or the intention of the parties. Kasi may mga times na yung isang bagay o isang object ay maaaring maging divisible, gaya ng pera. Pero ang intention kasi ng parties ay hindi kailangan ng performance or capable partial fulfillment. Ito ay magiging indivisible ang isang bagay or isang object. Even though the object or services may be physically divisible, an obligation is divisible if so provided by law or intended by the parties. If the object is not physically divisible or the service is not suitable partial performance, that obligation is always indivisible, the intention of the parties to the contrary notwithstanding. This rule is absolute. Applicability of Article 1223. Well, Article 1223 appears to be limited to real obligation because speak of things that word is used in the broad sense as preparing to the object or presentation of the obligation which may be to deliver a thing or to render. Example, Jessa agree to pay Ayesa 10,000 pesos for equal monthly installment. The obligation of Jessa is divisible because it is capable of partial fulfillment. Pero if the agreement of Jessa will pay Ayesa on a certain date, the full amount of 10,000 pesos, the obligation is indivisible. Although money is physically divisible because the intention of the parties is the obligation must be fulfilled at one time and as a whole. Hindi siya magiging partial. Take note, the divisibility of an obligation should not therefore be confused with the divisibility of the things which is the object thereof. Kinds of division. First, qualitative division, or one based on quality, not on number or quantity of the things which are the object of the obligation. Example, namatay yung parents si Juan, Pedro at Di Salvador. Tapos yung parents sila may naiwang bahay, lupa at sasakyan. Kunyari, mapupunta kay Salvador, yung bahay, kay Pedro, yung sasakyan, at kay Juan, yung lupa. Ang pag-divide sa kanila is quality. Quantitative division are based on quantity rather than quality. Example, Mike and Reggie divides the 200 kilos of sugar. So, by 100 sila. Third, idea or intellectual division are one which exists only in the minds of the parties. Example, ito naman ay walang actual na hatian. Kunwari, example, Stephanie and I inherit a car. As kami yung owner nung sasakyan, hindi namin pwedeng hatiin yon in equal part. So, paano mangyayari yon? So, the car is actually not separable material way mentally. Kinds of indivisibility. First, legal indivisibility, where a specific provision of law declares as indivisible obligation which by their nature are divisible. Second, conventional indivisibility, where the will of the parties make as indivisible obligation which by their nature are divisible. Third, natural indivisibility, where the nature of the object or pretension does not admit of division. Example, to give a particular car, to sing a song, and etc. So let's proceed to Article 1224. A joint indivisible obligation gives rise to indemnity for damages from the time any one of the debtor does not comply with his undertaking. The debtor who may have been ready to fulfill their promises shall not contribute to the indemnity beyond the corresponding portion of the price of the things or of the object of the services in which the obligation consists. So, it's talk about the effect of non-compliance by a debtor in a joint indivisible obligation. So, what is the effects of non-compliance by a debtor in a joint indivisible obligation? If any one of the debtor does not comply with his undertaking in a joint indivisible obligation, the obligation is converted into one damages. So, pwede naman hindi talaga mag-comply ang debtor and obligation joint is indivisible. So, ulitin ko ulit, ang isang object or isang bagay ay indivisible, then the liability of the debtor are joined. So, take note, the creditor cannot ask for specific performance of pretension because there is cause of action against other debtors who are willing to fulfill their promises. So, let's proceed to Article 1225. For the purpose of the preceding articles, obligation to give defined things and those which are not susceptible of partial performance shall be deemed be indivisible. When the obligation has for its object the execution of a certain number of days of work, the accomplishment of work by metric units, or analogous things which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance, it should be divisible. However, even though the object or service may be physically divisible, an obligation is indivisible is so provided by law or intended by the parties. In obligation not to do, indivisibility or indivisibility should be determined by character of the pretension in each particular case. So, it's talk about the obligation deemed indivisible. Ano nga ba ang obligation deemed indivisible? The above article lays down the general rule for determining the divisibility or indivisibility of an obligation as being seen. However, the purpose of the obligation is the controlling circumstance. This rule applies not only the obligation to give, but also to those of doing or not doing. Divisible and divisible obligation are not to be confused with divisible and indivisible contracts. So, there are 4 instances wherein the obligation is deemed indivisible. First, obligation to give defined things. Indivisible, always. Example, to give a particular electric pan, to deliver a specific house. And take note, the obligation is indivisible because of the nature of the subject matter. Number 2, obligation which are not sustainable of partial performance. Example, to sing a song, to dance sa tinikling. Take note, the obligation is indivisible by reason of the purpose which require the performance of all the parts. So may tanong, is the obligation still indivisible if there are more than one participant? The obligation becomes divisible as far as the participants are concerned because it is capable of partial performance. Number 3, obligation provided by law to be indivisible even if things or services physically divisible. Example, under the law, tax should be paid within a defined period. Although money is physically divisible, the amount of tax payable must be delivered in toto, not partially. 4, obligation intended by the parties to be indivisible even if things or service is physically divisible. Example, the obligation of D to give 1,000 to C on a certain date. Money is physically divisible, but the clear intention here is for D deliver 1,000 at one time and as a whole. So my question, suppose there are 2 debtors, D and E, is the obligation still indivisible? The obligation becomes divisible as far as D and E are concerned because the delivery of 1,000 pesos can be done in part. Example, 500 pesos by D and 500 pesos by E. As far as C is concerned, the obligation is remain indivisible because the performance cannot be done in parts. Obligation deemed divisible. First, obligation which have for their object the execution of a certain number of days' work. Example, nasa construction, painting house within a 10 days. Number 2, obligation which have for their object the accomplishment of work by metrical units. Example, the obligation of D makes a table 1.5 meter wide and 4 meter long. The obligation of D and B to deliver 20 cubic meter of sand. But the obligation of D alone to deliver 20 cubic meters of sand is indivisible. 3, obligation which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance. Example, the obligation of D teach obligation and contrast for 1 year in a university. The obligation of E to render 3 song numbers in a program. The obligation of F to pay a debt of 12,000 in a 12 monthly installment of 1,000. But each pretension to pay 1,000 is indivisible as it is to be delivered at one time and its totality. Divisibility or indivisibility in obligation not to do. In negative obligation not to do, the character of the pretension in each particular case shall determine their divisibility or indivisibility. Example, indivisible obligation, obliged himself to be not to sell cigarette in his store for 1 year. The obligation should be fulfilled continuously during a certain period. Divisible obligation, if the obligation of A is not to sell cigarette in his store only during Sunday and holidays, that obligation is divisible because the forbearance is not continuous. So, bakit naging indivisible ang number 1? Kasi, continuous siya. Ang sabi doon, 1 year. 1 year siyang hindi magbebenta ng cigarette. Tapos, sa divisible naman is Sunday and holidays lang siyang hindi magbebenta ng cigarettes. Notes: obligation to do and not to do are generally indivisible. Obligation to do stated in paragraph 2 of Article 1225 are divisible. So, let's proceed to Section 6, Article 1226 to Article 1230. Article 1226, in obligation with the penal clause, the penalty should substitute the indemnity for damages and the payment of interest in cases of non-compliance, if there is no stipulation to the contrary. Nevertheless, damages should be paid if the obliger refused to pay the penalty or is guilty or fraud in the fulfillment of the obligation. The penalty may be enforced only when it is demandable in accordance with the provision of this code. So, define muna natin kung ano ang meaning of principal and accessories obligation. Principal obligation is one which can stand by itself and does not depend for its validity and existence upon another obligation. Accessory obligation is one which is attached to a principal obligation and therefore cannot stand alone. So, what is the obligation with a penal clause? An obligation with a penal clause is one which contains an accessory undertaking to pay a previously stipulated indemnity in cases of breach of the principal pretension intended primarily to induce its fulfillment. It's important to make sure na magko-comply. So, meaning of penal clause. A penal clause is an accessory undertaking attached on an obligation to assume greater liability in cases of breach, etc. The obligation is not fulfilled or is partly or irregularly complied with. So, the purpose of penal clause is to ensure the performance by creating an effective deterrent against breach, making the consequence of such breach as onerous as it may be possible. This is general purpose of penal clause. And to substitute the penalty for the indemnity for damages and the payment of interest in cases of non-compliance, or to punish the debtor for non-fulfillment or violation of his obligation. In the first case, the purpose is preparation. In the second case is punishment. Penal clause and condition distinguish. There are notable differences between the two. First, the first continues an obligation to accessory while latter that does not. Number 2, therefore, the former may become demandable if default of the unperformed obligation and sometimes jointly within, while the latter is never demandable. Penalty substitutes for damages and interest. As a general rule, in an obligation with penal clause, that the penalty takes the place of the indemnity for damages and the payment of interest in case of non-compliance. Proof of actual damages suffered by the creditor is necessary in order that the penalty may be enforced. When creditor may recover damages, the creditor, in addition to the penalty, may recover damages and interest. First, when so stipulated by the parties, kung provided ba talaga ng join. Number 2, when the obligor refused to pay the penalty, in which cases the creditor may recover legal interest thereon. Kung ayaw mo pa talaga magbayad ng penalty, mas madodoblehan ka kung pwede ka namang mag-recover ng interest. Number 3, when the obligor is guilty of fraud in the fulfillment of the obligation, in which cases creditor may recover damages caused by such fraud. Meron pa diyang damages. When penalty may be enforced, the penalty may be enforced only when it is demandable in accordance with the provision of the Civil Code. This means the penalty as stipulation in a contract is demandable only if there is a breach of the obligation and is not contrary to law, morals, good custom, public order, or public policy. Let's proceed to Article 1227. The debtor cannot exempt himself from the performance of the obligation by paying the penalty, save in the cases where this right has been expressly reserved for him. Neither can be creditor demand the fulfillment of the obligation and the justification of the penalty at the same time, unless this right has been clearly granted him. However, if after the creditor has decided to require the fulfillment of the obligation, the performance thereof should become impossible without his fault, the penalty may be enforced. It's talk about the penalty not substitute for performance. So, what is the penalty not substitute for performance? Generally, the debtor cannot just pay the penalty instead of performing the obligation. Precisely, the purpose of the penalty is to secure compliance with his obligation. If the debtor is allowed to pay the penalty, this will in effect make the obligation an alternative one. So, the debtor can exempt himself from the non-fulfillment of the obligation and only when the right being expressly reserved from him. Yeah, it's correct kasi option naman niya na kung magbabayad na lang siya ng penalty, magiging the obligation, pay the penalty, it will become applicable. No, it will become the alternative. Penal clause resumes subsidiary. As a general rule, the creditor cannot demand the fulfillment of the obligation and the substitution of the penalty at the same time. The primary purpose of the penalty is to urge the debtor to the performance of the main obligation. So they have two kinds where there is performance. First, where there is performance, once the obligation is fulfilled, the purpose is attained and therefore there is no need for demanding the penalty. So, sabi ko nga kanina na penalties only enforceable when there is breach in the obligation. Number 2, where there is no performance. In case of non-compliance, the creditor may ask for the penalty or required specific performance. Meron siyang two remedies kapag may meron siyang two remedies na the remedies are alternative and not cumulative nor successive, such to the exception that the penalty may be enforced after the creditor has decided to require fulfillment. The same should become impossible without his fault. So take note, if there was fault on the part of the debtor and the creditor may recover the penalty as well as damages for non-fulfillment. So let's proceed to Article 1228. Proof of actual damages suffered by the creditor is not necessary in order that penalty may be demandable. So it's talk about the penalty demandable without proof of actual damages. So ano nga ba yon? If an obligation with a penal clause, all the creditor has to prove to enforce the penalty is the violation of the obligation by the debtor by the debtor. So breach lang or the violation of the obligation by the debtor para makakapag-connect ka or makapag-demand ka ng payment of penalty. So take note, the creditor may enforce the penalty whether he suffered damage or not, but he cannot recover more than the stipulated penalty even if he proves that the amount of his damages exceed the penalty. So, damages recoverable in addition to penalty must be proved. Article 1228 applies only where the penalty is fixed by the parties to substitute the indemnity for damages. So, there is need a penalty. Dapat may penal clause tayo para magamit natin yung penalty and indemnity for damages. Dapat kasi magkaroon tayo ng stipulation kung walang penal damages lang. Take note, if on any of three exemption with damages may be recovered in addition to the penalty, the creditor must prove the amount of such damages he actually suffered resulting from the breach of the principal obligation. So let's proceed to the last article. Article 1229, the judge shall equitable reduce the penalty when the principal obligation has been partly or irregularly complied with by the debtor. Even if there has been no performance, the penalty may also be reduced by the court if it's injurious or unconscionable. So it's talk about the penalty may be reduced by the courts. So ano nga ba yon? The rule in Article 1229 is evited justice. The penalty provided for it, the penal clause, may be reduced by the court. First, when there is partial or irregular performance. Second, when the penalty agreed upon is injurious or unconscionable. Example, partial or irregular performance. Ibig sabihin, may performance pero partial lang. Second, penalty is injurious or unconscionable. Ito naman, kapag sobra-sobra naman yung magiging amount ng penalty. So, let's proceed to the last article, Article 1230. The nullity of the penal clause does not carry if it that of the principal obligation. The nullity of the principal obligation carries with it of the penal clause. So, it's talk about the effect of nullity of the penal clause. So, ano nga ba yun? The general principle that the accessory follows the principal and not vice versa, as illustrated in the above article. If only the penal clause is void, the principal obligation remains valid and demandable. The penal clause is just disregarded. The injured party may recover indemnity for damages in cases of non-performance of the obligation as if non-penalty has been stipulated. So, the nullity of the penal clause is invalid takes the principle of an obligation. Can stand alone. Example, S agreed to sell merchandise to B. It is provided if their agreement that is cases of default, S will deliver a prohibited drugs as penalty. The obligation to sell merchandise is valid, but the penalty to deliver the prohibited drug is void. For failure of S to comply with his obligation, B may recover damages. So, effect of nullity of the principal obligation. If the principal obligation is void, the penal clause is likewise void. The reason is that the clause cannot stand alone without the principal obligation to which it is subordinated. Kung walang principal, walang penal clause. But if nullity of the principal obligation is due to the fault of debtor, who act it bad faith by reason of which the creditor suffer damages on equitable runs, the penalty may be enforced. Example, S agreed to deliver to B 2 grams of prohibited drugs. The contract carries a penal clause to the effect that in case of non-compliance with the obligation, S will pay a penalty of 10,000 pesos. So, ang principal obligation is to deliver 2 grams prohibited drugs. So, ang accessory obligation is S will pay a penalty of 10,000 pesos of non-compliance.